Before airplanes or cargo ships, there was only one way to get the world's most precious goods from east to west: a deadly, thousands of miles long ancient trade network called the Silk Road. Except it wasn't called that. Not by the merchants who walked it, not by the empires that taxed it, not by anyone who lived and died along it. The name Silk Road is younger than the telephone. It was coined in 1877 by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in the first volume of a survey of China built on his own expeditions through the 1860s and the 1870s. He wasn't writing history for its own sake. He was scouting mining opportunities and a possible railway route to Europe. He needed a phrase for the ancient tracks he was mapping, and he chose Die Seidenstrasse, the Silk Road. The name sat quietly in academic literature for decades, until one of his students, a Swedish explorer named Sven Hedin, published a book under that title in 1936 and made it famous. Hedin was blunt about where it came from. The name, he wrote, is not Chinese, and it was never used in China. So sit with that for a moment. The most famous overland trade route in human history was named by a 19th century European surveyor looking for places to build a railroad. Before him, there was no single term that unified these routes at all. Not in Chinese, not in Persian, not in Latin. The people who actually used the network had no concept of the Silk Road, because from where they stood, there was no such thing. And once you know that, the other cracks start showing. It wasn't a road, silk wasn't the main cargo. Almost nobody travelled its length. And the single most important thing it moved wasn't a good at all, none of which makes it less remarkable. The trade was real, the wealth was real, and the consequences reshaped Eurasia for 1500 years. But the version most of us learned, one road, one caravan, silk from China to Rome, is a 19th century simplification of something far stranger and far more interesting. So here's what was actually out there. The story starts with a mission that failed. In the year 138 BC, the Han Emperor Wu sent a court official named Jiang Qian west, out past the edge of the known Chinese world. His job was diplomatic. Find a people called the Yuezhi and recruit them as allies against the Xiongnu, the nomadic confederation raiding China's northern frontier. It went badly almost immediately. Jiang Qian was captured by the Xiongnu and held for roughly a decade. He eventually escaped, pressed on, reached Central Asia, and the kingdoms he'd been sent to recruit turned him down flat. By the terms of his own assignment, the mission was a complete failure. He came home with something else. Jiang Qian returned carrying detailed intelligence about the lands to the west. The kingdoms, the peoples, the goods, the markets of Sogdiana, and the extraordinary horses of the Fergana Valley. The emperor didn't punish him. He promoted him because what Jiang Qian had brought back was a map of opportunity. Within a generation, organized caravans were moving west. A Han general named Ban Chao later secured those western corridors by force, and around 97 AD, his envoy Gan Ying pushed all the way to the Persian Gulf, the furthest west any Han official had ever reached. Together, Jiang Qian's intelligence and Ban Chao's campaigns gave the Han dynasty its grip on what they called the western regions. And the shape of what they moved through is the thing to understand. From the Han capital at Chang'an, modern Xi'an, the route ran out through the Gansu corridor. Then it hit the Taklamakan Desert, one of the most hostile places on the planet, and split rather than crossing it. One branch skirted the north through oasis towns like Turpan and Kucha. Another traced the southern rim through Khotan. The two converged again at Kashgar, and from there the network pushed on into Persia and toward the Mediterranean. Notice what that is. Not a road, a braid. Paths that shifted with politics, weather, and which local ruler was currently charging what. The real fixed points weren't the tracks between them, they were the oasis cities, and those cities were the whole system. A caravan couldn't cross that desert without water, so whoever held the water held the trade. Every oasis was a market, a warehouse, a customs house, and a choke point all at once. One more correction before we go on. Silk wasn't the reason the route existed, and it wasn't the bulk of what moved. Archaeological evidence points to horses, glassware, and spices dominating by volume across many segments. Silk was the prestige item. The thing worth naming a route after, 18 centuries later, if you were a German geographer who needed a phrase. Here's the detail that dismantles the picture most of us have. Almost nobody travelled the Silk Road. Not the whole thing. The image of a merchant setting out from Chang'an and arriving in Rome is essentially a fiction. Very few travellers ever crossed the network end to end. Instead, the trade worked as a relay. A Chinese merchant might carry goods as far as the frontier and sell them there. A Sogdian trader took them across Central Asia. A Kushan or Parthian intermediary moved them further west. A Persian or Syrian merchant handled the final leg to the Mediterranean coast. By the time a bolt of silk reached a Roman market, it had changed hands a dozen times or more, and every single one of those hands took a cut. That's the actual engine of the whole system, and it's worth being precise about it, because it explains something that puzzles people about ancient prices. The goods didn't become expensive because anyone improved them. They became expensive because of distance and tolls. Each intermediary adding markup, each oasis charging for water and passage, each empire taxing what crossed its territory. Nothing was added to the silk between China and Rome except cost. The people who ran this best were the Sogdians, from what's now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. They weren't an empire. They had no great army. What they had was a diaspora, trading communities strung across Central Asia and deep into China, and a language that became the commercial lingua franca of the entire network. Sogdian merchants dominated this trade for more than 1,000 years. They were the connective tissue of Eurasia, and most people watching this have never heard their name. Now hold that structure in your head, because it's the same structure that drives the history of the spice trade. Whoever controls the middle sets the price. That was true of the Nabateans on the incense route. It was true of the Sogdians here. And it stayed true right through to Constantinople and the Ottomans. Every overland trade route in history eventually produces the same arrangement. A chain of middlemen who own the ground, and buyers at the far end paying a fortune for goods that were cheap where they came from. And every buyer at the far end of such a long chain eventually asks the same question. What if we could go around? The most consequential things that moved along these routes were never on anyone's inventory. They had no price, no weight, and nobody set out to trade them. They travelled because people did. Start with religion. Buddhism left India and moved north and east along these corridors, carried by monks and merchants into Central Asia and then into China, where it reshaped the spiritual life of a civilization of tens of millions. The Kushan Empire, one of those middleman powers sitting at the crossroads of Persian, Greek and Indian influence, became a major patron of it, most famously under Emperor Kanishka I around the 1st and 2nd century, who convened a great Buddhist council and sponsored the faith's spread into Central Asia. Bamiyan, in what is now Afghanistan, became one of the great Buddhist centers along this corridor. its colossal cliff-carved Buddhas standing for over a millennium, as markers of just how deeply the faith had taken root in these mountain crossroads. Further east, the cave complex at Dunhuang, carved into cliffs at the edge of the Taklamakan, accumulated thousands of Buddhist manuscripts and murals over centuries. Preserved almost by accident until a wandering monk unsealed a hidden library in 1900. Later, Christianity, including Nestorian Christianity, which spread east along these very routes into Persia, Central Asia, and deep into Tang Dynasty China, Manichaeism and Islam, moved along the same paths. None of that was cargo. All of it changed the world more permanently than any bolt of silk. Then, technology. Paper was invented in China and travelled west along these routes, and it's difficult to overstate what that did. Every bureaucracy, every library, every book in the Western world eventually rests on it. Gunpowder made the same journey and rewrote European warfare, and through it, European politics. Neither of these was a trade good in the way pepper was. They were techniques. Knowledge that leaked from one civilization to another because merchants and monks and prisoners kept moving through the same oasis towns. Information moved too, and often it was wrong. For most of this period, Rome and China barely understood one another. Each knew the other existed as a rumour at the far end of a very long chain. The Romans called the eastern source of silk Syris the Silk People, and knew almost nothing else about them. Silk had been arriving in Mediterranean markets through Persian middlemen before Zhang Qian ever went west, and those middlemen had no interest in revealing where it actually came from. Concealing the source was the business model. And then there's the cargo nobody wanted. Disease travelled these networks as efficiently as silk did. Better, in fact, because plague didn't need a buyer. The same connectivity that carried paper and Buddhism carried epidemics between populations with no immunity to each other's microbes. Every trade network in history has run this double ledger. The connection is the benefit, and the connection is the danger, and you can't have one without the other. That's the part the name gets most wrong. Call it the Silk Road, and you make it a story about a luxury fabric. It was actually the mechanism by which the eastern and western halves of Eurasia infected each other. With ideas, with faiths, with inventions, and with plague. The network didn't die in a war, it was made obsolete. For 15 centuries, the overland routes worked because there was no alternative. Goods had to cross the middle of the world, which meant they had to pass through everyone who owned a piece of that middle. But from the late Middle Ages onward, maritime trade began taking over, and the logic of the whole system inverted. A ship doesn't pay tolls at an oasis. A ship doesn't hand its cargo to 12 intermediaries. Put the goods on the water, and the entire chain of middlemen, the thing that made the trade expensive, simply stops applying. That's the hinge that connects this story to everything that came after it. The pressure that pushed Europe onto the ocean wasn't curiosity about the shape of the world. It was arithmetic. Buyers at the far end of a long overland chain were paying enormous sums for goods that were cheap at the source, and the moment sailing around became technically possible, going around became inevitable. Portugal down the coast of Africa, Columbus westward, the Dutch and English companies that followed. The whole violent maritime scramble that defines the history of the spice trade begins as an attempt to escape a middleman. They succeeded, and the caravans thinned. The oasis cities that had been the richest places in Asia drifted toward the margins. Some are ruins now. Some are ordinary towns whose names nobody outside the region recognizes, sitting on ground that once set the price of the most valuable goods on earth. Which brings us back to the name. The routes were already centuries dead when a German geographer, surveying China for mining prospects and a railway line, needed a phrase for the old tracks on his map, and wrote down Die Seidenstrasse, the Silk Road. It was a good phrase. It was so good that it travelled better than most of the cargo ever had. Into every textbook, every documentary, and eventually into modern geopolitics, where governments now compete over who gets to use it. But it describes a road that was never a road. Named for a fabric that was never the main cargo, walked end to end by almost nobody. What actually existed out there was messier and more human. 1,000 years of oasis towns, borrowed languages, taxed water, and traders who never once imagined they were part of a single thing. We gave it a name 18 centuries late, and the name is the only part of it that was ever simple.